I was a little disappointed to find the drinks bar wasn't open, because it was last night. It was tremendous. It was Palace de Chardonnay, I think. So we got our own, so we've self-catered. So if the licensing people are here, we apologise unreservedly. Kia ora koutou i te whānau, no mai haere mai. Welcome everyone to Short Stories for Short Attention Spans, which I was asked to host because I work in television. And so I've adapted this event accordingly. What we're going to do is take an ad break every 10 minutes, and then I'll come back and spend the first 3 minutes reminding us what we've learnt so far. It'll be fucking tremendous. It's wonderful to be here. And as I do every year, I'd really like to marvel at the gorgeous and triumphant audacity of making this weekend happen and making this weekend so very, very good. It really is becoming very special. So congratulations to the organisers, and thank you to the organisers, the sponsors, the many volunteers, and the writers who have come, in this case, in alphabetical order by first name. Ashleigh Young, Carl Shuker, Madison Hamill, Maddie Hamill, and Noelle McCarthy, which is a really fine quartet to spend an hour in the company of. We are delighted and we are so grateful you have come. Noelle, of course, has come all the way from Featherston itself, and we really appreciate it. I do want to begin by saying, as I did to Mary Biggs, Mary, are you here? She's in so many places all at once that she may not be, but as I said to Mary Biggs when she floated the idea of this session, that people with long attention spans can and do love short stories and essays and poetry. So I'm not judging you all for being here as if you were all Dory in Finding Nemo. I'm not looking out and thinking that. God knows sometimes you don't want 3 books about Frank Bascombe, right, totaling 1,500 pages. And sometimes you do, which brings me to Carl Shuker, because he's a brilliant writer. And I'm delighted he's with us. But he's a novelist, ladies and gentlemen. So having him here today is like inviting a vegan to a sausage sizzle. So, Carl, welcome. And we won't be mean about your capacity to hold us for long lengths of time. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised Carl's writing always leaps out at me, demanding my attention, utterly overwhelming the moots assumption today that anything longer than a text or a tweet or maybe a haiku on special occasions would lose me. How does he do this? Stay with us. We'll be back after the break. How does he do this? In part, he does this stylistically. Take the way Carl writes in A Mistake, which is such a good book. I'm holding it up because I think it's on sale here. And if you haven't read it, and I sense from the murmurs of recognition that some of you have, I can't recommend it highly enough. This is his most recent universally acclaimed novel, Ockham finalist last year, and it is available for you here to purchase this weekend if you don't already have it. Interestingly, it has meat on the front. It took me a while to realise what that cover was. I just thought it was a pretty colour, and then I realised it's actually inside somebody. Kieran Dass was bang on in her rave review of A Mistake. Gosh, she's a good reviewer, which she described as a thrilling, brutal, and unforgettable read, but she also referred to as clipped and refined. Spare, Charlotte Grimshaw called it, evoking Hemingway's iceberg method, which started with his journalism and carried through to his short stories. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the way Hemingway wrote. Clearly anticipating the moot for today's session, Charlotte Grimshaw insisted, and I quote, "Shuker has the right stuff to keep the reader engrossed and shaken to the end." Yes. The word I want to use for this is vital. That was the word that kept occurring to me as I read it. In A Mistake, vital has the extra sense of being a life and death matter, but Carl's ability to compel us forward by giving us no alternative but to go forward, by writing in a way in which there are no intricacies to be lost in, none of what Henry James so wonderfully called large, loose, baggy monster writing, and also by making us really care about the people created by letters on a page. It's a vital, vivid, visceral book, all the V words. We love alliteration in television. The opening chapter of Mistake is stunning. It really is a kind of face slap, and it utterly compels our attention, no matter what our attention spans are. And from that point on, we need to know because we care. I want to deviate here briefly because the problem with panels at literary festivals is that you're desperate to find out what your panelists have in common. They all have fingers, clearly, noses, feet. Three of them, Madison, Carl and Ashleigh, have Masters in Creative Writing from that extraordinary course at Vic, right? Ashleigh, according to the end of Madison's incredible collection of personal essays, Specimen, was also Madison's supervisor, then her editor. And the three books I have here, including Carl's Mistake, are all published by VUP, but that's just VUP showing off as usual. So I phoned Noelle on Monday in pursuit of commonality, and she sent me two pieces of her writing to confuse me even further. I don't know if you've read them, but the first was Mammy, Eve, and Jesus, a personal essay. Remember the description personal essay, by the way, because I think we'll talk about it a bit this afternoon. Published by Newsroom under Steve Braunius, who's doing great work there. If you haven't read Mammy, Eve, and Jesus, a personal essay, you should. It deserves all the praise it's received. Go to Newsroom and search for Noelle, you'll find it there. And the second was a topographic memoir of addiction and recovery, which was published in Metro, right? Which begins, when I was newly sober and raw as a rubbed eyelid, my God was in the sky tower. Imagine if you wrote that, you'd ask yourself out on a date afterwards, wouldn't you? Speaking of asking yourself on a date, Noelle doesn't drink any longer, obviously, because but she went off to buy the wine for the rest of us to drink. So we say, I appreciate. $50. Yeah. Yeah. Noelle spent $50 of my money, but it was money well spent, Noelle. Noelle, by the way, is writing something longer. I can't wait for it. I carry books about with me in this bag, like people carry family photos in their wallet, treasures, and I can't wait for your book to join them, Noelle. So is this what they have in common? Their ability to make us care enough and lose ourselves enough for even our egregiously short attention spans to find themselves captured. This brings me to Ashleigh Young, who is sitting beside me here, whose writing I adore. I truly treasure this book, and here again the writer's ability to arrest our wandering minds, to make the clocks tick silent, to make us even put our phones down for once and be with nothing but the words. Ashleigh Young's writing, particularly in this treasure, Can You Tolerate This?, is so tenderly personal, so generous in its calm invitation for us to really see it, that I have reread it and reread it and reread it. This is my signed copy. I have a reading copy too with notes all through it. I buy them for people as presents, I lend them out, and I don't ask for them back. And so there are my copies of this book throughout the greater Tamaki Makaurau region. And here's what Ashleigh does. She invites us into the experience of being her. Or does she? Does she really? I'm going to ask her that. I asked Jenny Bornhold recently if a poem of hers was true, and she replied something along the lines of, kind of. Only more eloquently, it being Jenny, of course. And at the end of Specimen, Madison tells us everything that happens is true to memory. But then she talks about two things she made up, because sometimes the truth requires lying, which is Camus' great line about fiction, right? Fiction is a lie in order to tell the truth. Every time I read Can You Tolerate This?, I'm there drinking the coffee that tastes like the garage, or struggling with the high school shyness that makes a person disappear at morning breaks and lunch times, or the self-consciousness that makes a person wear heavy jumpers even on very hot days. Like Noelle, like Madison, Ashleigh spares herself nothing, and in doing so, as Carl does with Dr. Elizabeth Lives Taylor, this makes the type words human and real, and it really invites us in. Just before we go on, as an aside, 2 years ago I did a session with Shane Carter in Auckland for dead people I've known. I know that Shane was here. Many of you would have come and seen it, I think, with my friend Richard Langston. Edited by Ashleigh Young. Carl thanks Ashleigh at the end of A Mistake. Madison's Specimen is edited by Ashleigh, and on it goes. For a decade now, give or take, Ashleigh's support of writers and writing in this country has been a striking act of love, for want of a better word. Thank you, Ashleigh. That's where Madison Hamill comes in. Whoops-a-daisy. Although I hasten to add immediately that her voice has a stop you in your tracks originality. I've been hearing people rave about Specimen, reading them rave about it, and then it was long list of the Ockhams, then it was short list of the Ockhams, and as the spin-off pointed out, the cull was brutal this year. Shit, it was a great long list. Getting it down to a short list must have been so hard. And then Mary Biggs said Madison would be here, and I'm a terrible snob, and I hate being told that I'm going to like something, because I want to discover it myself first so I can tell people they're going to like something, because that's the kind of wanker I am. But anyway, I wandered along to Dear Reader, a beautiful bookshop in Grey Lynn, and I bought it, and wow, to quote Bill Manhire, wow. She's 25 and a goddamn genius, Catherine Wolfe said. Yep, and a particular one too. As I said, I can't recall meeting anyone quite like her in a book. There was a moment in Ireland, and you might say this is horseshit, John, where Holden Caulfield, if he'd had a university education, briefly, flittingly sprung to mind. Nope. But other than that, I've never, ever come across a voice like it. It's extraordinary originality. Sometimes it made me feel like I was a passenger in a stolen car that Madison was driving fast. Other times I felt like I'd been admitted to a super cool secret club that I had no right to be anywhere near and was waiting to be expelled from at any moment. Let me stay, I was thinking as a reader. Slow down, don't slow down, I was thinking as a passenger in the car. Wow, I was thinking as a lover of writing. All those people who said it's outrageously good are right. And so here we are in the company of these four writers. The women in the middle, the men on either side, like a 1950s barn dance. And we are so grateful that the four of you, well, Noelle was already here, the three of you plus Noelle have come to Booktown Featherston to be with us. And so, and we're also grateful that you were here. It's wonderful to have you here. The session is sold out and we're thrilled to be with you. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And Ashleigh, Carl, Madison, and Noelle, kia ora rawa atu. Thank you and welcome. Right. I want to ask, when you write, let's deal with the moot. And I don't know who's going to start. And Madison, is this your first ever literary panel, Madison?
Yes, this is my first time being interviewed live, which is a bit terrifying.
Well, let's start with you, because it's,
Right.
I reckon the worst thing is sitting around waiting, right? Isn't that what Dostoevsky said about capital punishment? And it's not as bad as capital punishment. But as, how old are you, 25?
I've just turned 26.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So as a 26-year-old, do you write? Do you think about attention spans when you write?
When I was writing this book, I definitely, when I started out, I knew I was a little bit... I have a short attention span when I'm reading for pleasure. I want to be dragged along. So I guess I was thinking about that when I start out my essays. I want to just like trick people into reading them. I'm like, give them something that they have to figure, like something that pulls them along. Because, I know that people like me want to be dragged into an essay rather than having to do a lot of work to become engaged in it.
And Ashleigh, as Madison's editor, was this apparent from the outset? Was this, because it is breakneck. I mean, it has one of the fastest senses of pace of anything I've read in a long time, right? Yeah. Was that there from the outset?
Oh, absolutely. I had to do very little work. It almost feels a little bit egregious to call myself an editor on this book.
That's not true.
Well, I think that sense of pace comes from what Madison pays attention to. Often just the strangest things, but your images, the little observations, especially about your parents, I have to say, they're so precise, and I think they give that sense of moving along inside your world. There was very little whittling away that we had to do. Which, it made me feel a little bit extraneous, but also it's wonderful because I get to be on the sidelines kind of cheering. And also as Maddie's supervisor, when Madison did the MA in creative writing, I got to watch all of these pieces take shape. And maybe, the only problem seemed to be deciding what to write because there were so many ideas. I remember, at one point, you sort of had a list of all these things you still wanted to write, and I could feel your attention. There were sort of these tantalising subjects and experiences that you wanted to dig into, but then the constraints of the course said, you've got to decide. And I think you have really great instincts as a writer that helped you make those decisions.
If you're, Noelle and Carl, I'm going to come to you in a sec, but Madison, I want to come back to you for a sec. If you're writing for short attention spans, and there's nothing pejorative about a short attention span. When we celebrate Catherine Mansfield's short stories, it's all about Chekhov short stories. Some of my favourite poets the kind of early to mid 20th century Americans, Carlos Williams and E. Cummings and stuff, wrote super short poems, and they're beautiful. They're almost perfect. But do you have to be unsentimental with yourself? Do words go, or do you start fast and just keep it fast?
I like to start fast, I guess. I don't like long descriptions, so I just like to get the bones of it down first and only flesh out as much as needs to be there and not go too far.
Which is a good time to bring Carl in, because if I think of the reviews of Mistake, and I had them on my notes, which I didn't bring with me, which was a bit silly, but I can remember them. The Spare, Razor, I think 2 different reviewers used Razor. It's really, it's precisely what Maddie was just describing then. It's really, really clipped. That first chapter does an enormous amount with a very small number of words. And by the end of the first chapter, we are utterly hooked, aren't we? So do you write and then pare back, or is that how you wrote?
I'm trying to... I've got about 10 different responses in my head because you've brought up so many interesting things really fast. So I'm trying to curate them down real fast. But I'm thinking, so this book, the intention to do something really, descriptions bore me too. They did when I was starting this book, and I'm reading Brideshead Revisited for the first time, shame, but I'm reading that for the first time now, and my previous Evelyn Waugh book was Vile Bodies, and Vile Bodies, if you haven't read it, is the most vicious, sarcastic, ironic, and short little book. It's amazing. And Brideshead Revisited is this baggy, God, it goes on forever, and there's these 2 guys wandering around observing all the stuff in the house, and it's so boring. And a friend of mine said to me, if they just got it on, we could move on.
They're Catholics, Carl.
Yeah, and of course there would be no book, but yeah. So is there a moment that we're in where prose needs to be doing things differently? I certainly felt that when I was doing this book. And
wow.
Yeah, well, my previous stuff was very much about... I'll be hard on myself. It was about display, and it was about I'll describe everything for you so that you really believe you're there, and I'll go on and on and on, and you'll listen to me and you'll think, clever Carl, well done you, and I was just, it was a defensive thing. It was
a what thing?
A defensive thing.
Right, a shop window or something.
Yeah, it's it's asserting yourself. It's very male kind of ambitious thing.
So was there a willful determination with a mistake to not do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Premeditated?
Yeah. And there were structural limitations because I had 2 days a week to write it, and that was in school hours. I had to make a living, I had to look after my kids, so I didn't have much time. And I'd always had this ambition to write, pure, do real pure minimalism. Could I do it? Because it's real hard. And so all those things, the structural limitations, the wanting to do something, coalesced around this idea. And then it was what you were bringing up before about not letting the truth get in the way of a good yarn. That sort of idea was, I brought together 2 Health and Disability Commissioner reports for the titular mistake. And it was... they're 2 different operations with 2 different outcomes, but you bring them together and there's a truth that comes out of that, hopefully. But yeah, it was an amazing feeling, because in these other books it feels like life goes on and on. You never get to the end of this thing. And with this, it's well, I've got 5 hours now, deliver something. It's Pip Adam talks about writing her last book in 15 minutes a day, and I'm like...
She said she regretted that in the last session, actually, that I just had with
her.
She'd
she
like
wanted
to
20.
apologise for that statement. But I'm so glad you've talked about that, though, Carol, those structural limitations.
Well, I wanted, because you've started short and you're going long. So are you writing?
Yeah, I started. So I'm writing a full-length book now. But the essay you talked about, which was originally published as it was called Buck Rabbit when it was first published, and it was originally published in Ireland because I entered a competition, and the constraints of the competition were that the piece had to be 4,000 words long, and I wrote it in 23-minute bursts because that's how long an episode of the Octonauts is. And so I would write it when my little girl was watching TV, and I'd never written anything that was 4,000 words long, but I had written newspaper columns and things that were 800 words long. So if I divided it up into 4,000 word pieces, then I could write it, and I could write it in 23 minutes ago. You know, I could do it that way, and that's how it ended up being sort of 1,000-word vignettes. You know, that gave it its shape, and it's, I don't know, you know, it is what it is because of those constraints.
Although, by God, the momentum is forwards. It doesn't feel like standalone vignettes, doesn't it? It's extraordinary. Yeah. I don't know if, boy, it's very, very good writing. As I said to you the other day, I can't wait to read what you write long.
Well, the funny thing is people thought I made it up. You know, it's non-fiction. And lots of people said, you know, that's an interesting short story. And I said, no, it's, I don't know, do you get that with your work?
Yeah, I think people always kind of suspect that it's made up, which is interesting. Because I'm like, yeah, it's all true, but they're like,
is it?
Well, but it isn't, because nobody has the memory to remember dialogue from 5 years ago.
That's right.
So I think all nonfiction is a little bit made up, but then at the same time, there's that kind of contract that you have with the reader that, like, you're telling something true. So.
Does it have to be true? Does it? I always
it has to be true in spirit, I think. Yes. And that's a very sort of, you know, baggy answer that allows me to hide in different parts of it. But I had a conversation with my editor recently where she talked about dialogue, and she said, you know, you seem to have a very keen memory for this stuff. And, you know, I did have to think, do I remember that, or am I making it up? You know, is that how I wish it happened, or is that how it happened? And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's how I remember it, and it's fundamentally subjective, right? So
I sometimes make myself feel a little bit better about this when I remember that, like in the science of memory, supposedly each time you remember something, your brain is kind of making it up.
A new file. You're making a new memory
every
file.
single time. Yeah. It's adding little details. It's showing you your past maybe in a slightly different way, and it's really hard to tell just as a human with all of your foibles. What actually did happen, but that's all we have, right?
There are certain times in your life, though, when I think memories are particularly strong, like the piece I wrote about early sobriety. That could have happened 10 minutes ago, or, you know, yesterday for me, and that's possibly because of the sort of emotional state I was in at the time. I just remembered everything very well, but I'm not sure I've lived all of my life at that particular emotional pitch. Yeah.
When you're really scared, you remember every minutiae.
Yeah, you do.
But you do that in a mistake, you know, the description of that, you know, sort of catastrophic operation at the beginning. I just had these moments where I was thinking, I can't believe Carl isn't a surgeon, you know?
I want to come to this because I want to talk about, because this isn't memory. This is study. Yeah. But Madison, I can sense that you want to say something, and as the father of somebody roughly your age, I'm thinking, fuck, I'm going to get the young person in here, because my children always say, "Shut up, Dad, and listen to me." So, on behalf of my children, Madison.
I was just thinking that when I write something, it actually kind of starts to replace my actual memories, which is a big problem for, like, going back and thinking, like, now how accurate was that? Because now I don't know anymore. It's like, it's a more detailed memory now.
And my sister is really annoyed about that. I mean, the process of writing and about, you know, about childhood and my family, and I'm really interested in how you navigate that, Maddie. You know, how you write about people that you've grown up with and that you know, and how you've brought them into the stories.
I think for me, the main thing that I learned while I was writing this is just that if you write about someone with compassion and give them dimensions, then it's okay if your memory is faulty, or because memory is always faulty. And then so I've actually had really positive responses from everyone who's been in the book. I'm really lucky because I know everyone else
including
doesn't have
Mr. Woods.
Well, I haven't been in contact with him, so
I wondered about that.
Yeah, he'd be in the fetal position under a desk somewhere, I would have thought. What an arsehole.
yeah.
I mean, if you're here today, Mr. Woods, shame. Just one question for you, Noelle McCarthy. There's a detail when you drive past your mum's house, right? In the cab, you're in the cab, and the cabbie says, and you're heading down the road, and the cabbie says, the woman who lives in the house is a fucking bitch or something appalling. And you say, oh, I'm just 3 houses down. Did that actually happen?
We used to do that. Oh, God, yeah. And that's not just like, that's a shared family memory. And I mean, John and I go back a ways on this because we did an event, didn't we, about...
Pantograph punch
Yeah,
event.
a pantograph punch event about 5 years ago. And we all had to tell a story. You had to tell a true story. And they gave us a theme, didn't they? And yours was very sad and very moving, I remember. You talked about journalism. And I talked about my mother. And it was the first time that I'd ever spoken about my mother in sort of a public forum, but I figured I was safe enough because I was in New Zealand. And I wasn't, as it turned out, because they filmed it, but when I thought about my mother, what I thought about were taxi drivers, because they had this enmity. She had a sort of, it was because she'd never been able to drive, and it's quite moving for me now because I live in Featherston and I have to drive a car, and it's something that my mother never learned to do and couldn't do, and she just depended on these drivers to take her everywhere, and it was a massive power struggle every time. She needed them, but she resented them. She'd ring them in the middle of the day, and she'd make them take her to places. She'd make them take her back, and then she'd want to talk to them, and they'd want to go to the next job, because they're taxi drivers. But when I was going back to childhood and thinking about it, those are the hooks that I snagged on. Those were the things that were alive for me because they were, they were very real.
And so you are drawing on memory, and Madison, you are drawing on memory, and Ashleigh, you are drawing on memory, and I want to ask you in a moment about the memory you drew on, because it's very, tender. And I also want to ask you about the invention, the way characters just appear, like Paul McCartney visiting you in Te Kuiti, for example. But Carl, I want to bring you in here because you're not drawing on memory. So you have sat down, so yours is much more architectural, right? Or is it not? Is it a response? So if we talk about the Health and Disability Commission reports, if we talk about the surgeon who you credit at the end, who obviously really helped you, whose name has completely slipped my mind,
Alex Surides.
Surides, yeah. Where did that come from?
This is great. I'm going to be quiet while we listen. Assemble my thoughts. It's a complex and complicated mixture of all of that stuff, and it's a dream state and it's a flow state. When you assemble all those sort of intellectual resources and all that information and all that knowledge sufficient to represent something as complicated as a piece of surgery correctly, but then you'll notice, like from a purely architectural point of view, there's no more surgery in the book. Because initially I was going to have her do 3 surgeries, it's like you do 1, you sort of go, oh, what's happening? Do 2, oh yeah, I think she's competent. Do 3, there's a disaster. And that's kind of, it's like, no, okay, there's a short book. Short attention spans, we can't do that. So it was do 1 operation, do it properly, and this, I'm just letting you all in, where we're, absolute cheapskates novelists. You do 1 thing properly, and then I establish trust with you, hopefully. And you believe me, and you believe her. And then after that, it's aftermath, and it's about her as a human. And I think that, I could do surgeries again and again and again, but you don't really need it. So
you've shown what you needed to show.
I think so, yeah. And after that, a lot of it's me. The speeding through Wellington in the Camry, the dangerous driving. Sorry, it's me.
Going to Ryan Adams'
game. Yeah.
That was me. It wasn't, but yeah.
Actually, and I love the way you just reference things that we, Bunnings. I just love the way that, that here we are, this is our place. And, this is a great confidence in You know, when I was young, life was elsewhere. You know, we never referred to ourselves in literature. And if we did, it was with a terrible, we placed it there like mounting a butterfly, didn't we? And said, here's our New Zealand reference. And yours is effortlessly of this place. It's so good.
I think it's something I've always wanted since I was a kid and had that feeling, is that you're never reading about... There's no romance around Geraldine, is there? Do you know what I mean? No. So, you know, I always wanted that drama and that headiness around the places that I occupy. And a part of that's colonisation, obviously, and, you know, young country and all that. But that's what, you know, to me, my project in New Zealand, when it is in New Zealand, is about, you know, taking it seriously and just being literal. Like, I really sort of, I'm a bit past, you know, references to the city, and she took the train to the city.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
you know, to me, it's dead on the page. But when I see Bunnings,
Yeah, absolutely.
and when I see a halogen light for $49.95, something I just fireworks
we're all
go
there.
off.
Yeah, and
Excited by it.
I want to segue from Geraldine to Te Kuiti, and I want and your beautiful evocation of the place, and I think your strange ambivalence about it sometimes. Like when you wrote to Beck, is that a true story? And you were simultaneously embarrassed, but also proud of the fact that Te Kuiti was the shearing capital of the world, right?
I mean, I had to sell it to him somehow. I just, he'd asked about it as well, because in his response to me, he said, you know, and I imagine Beck's sounds like something like, wow, what's it like living in New Zealand? Like, and so I had to tell him the facts. So I wrote in response this very long, rambly email about walking my dog along the riverbank and about, Te Kuiti being...
Was it an email or a letter? Was it?
No, it was a letter.
It was a letter, physical letter, yeah.
Yeah.
And he asked you about did they do the funky chicken in New Zealand?
Yeah, he did. And referring to a particular dance. And this, I mean, it was a 2-line response from him. And one of them was asking if we did the funky chicken in New Zealand, which was just so mysterious to me. This was also the internet was still in its relatively early days. So, you know, my research avenues were kind of limited in regards to the funky chicken.
I love how you do embarrassment. Ashleigh. I read an essay you wrote not that long ago. I think it was in Henry Oliver's online magazine about your dad's book launch.
Oh, right.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, that was actually the last time I went back to Te Kuiti, and my dad has kind of cast himself into this role of kind of town historian. He no longer lives there, but he still goes up to visit the town a lot, and so he's just released his second book about the town. His first one was called The Story of Te Kuiti. This one is called My Story of Te Kuiti.
Getting more humble as he goes on.
And it was just so, I wasn't prepared for how kind of, it just made me feel a lot of feelings.
Yes. And I loved how much of those feelings you shared with us as readers. You know, I didn't do it on purpose when I started writing, telling people, you know, the readers, much more than I intended to do. I don't know how sort of, deliberate were you being with that? Were you deciding how much to reveal?
I was thinking about this whole idea of sort of brevity in writing, and I kind of realised I'm quite a fearful writer. I have to ride on these very short bursts of courage that I get, and when one comes along, I have to just grab it, and reveal as much as possible.
Which you did,
and you do.
That's often why. That's why I write in bed as well, is because once the courage is left, I can just sort of collapse and recover, and that's how I write.
I think that's why I write with a pen. Rather than, I don't know what you guys do, but I write longhand. I think you do too, because I saw you tweeted a passage from a mistake that you'd written longhand.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the organic feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like the composition period, and then you move on to the computer, and that's editing, and that's clinical, and that's me anyway.
What do you do?
I've adapted now. So I used to prefer writing with a pen, but now I just think through my typing fingers, and it just feels more natural to me. So
just marvel that anyone can physically write. I mean, I've just got a twisted claw now from I don't know how to write anymore. Longhand.
I want to, when you remember things differently, and I'm sure, well, you've had this with your sister, you've clearly had this with your family, although I don't think it's been contentious, has it? Maybe.
Is your brother a little bit?
Yes, at first.
Yes,
Yes, at
yes.
first. But yeah, like Maddie, I was fairly lucky. I have had, there are definitely things I would do differently. Probably the biggest issue was I have this very short piece in my book about this elderly neighbour who drove his car into the house, just bowled it over. Well, not bowled it, he just drove into the side of the house. And I have this very strong memory of it and about the time before and the time afterwards. And the time of driving into the house was sort of a landmark moment for me. But my mother was like, no, that never happened. No, sort of just very dismissive. And so I've just been kind of bamboozled that I have this memory that she doesn't at all.
And Madison, you have exactly the same thing with the poor cat in the sack. So feral cats, right? Feral cats, one is caught. Do you want to tell the story? Are the good people of Featherston ready for this story?
Well, in my memory, I know that we had traps to catch feral cats, and in my memory, one got trapped in there, and then for some reason my parents put it in a sack and hung it on the clothesline, and then called the guy to come out with a rifle, and then the guy just like stood there and shot at the sack until the blood dripped on the ground. And then like several years later, I was like asking my mum about this because I was just like, oh yeah, that happened. And then she was like, no, it didn't. Like, we wouldn't do that. They did have the traps, but I don't know what happened. They just took it away and took it to the pound or wherever. So
my sense is, being a parent myself, that it did happen and your mum was just lying through her teeth.
Because it's terrible. It's funny though with animals, isn't it? Because the first story or the first vignette in Mammy, Eve and Jesus is about the buck rabbit. And, the reason I remember that so vividly, so my mum came and picked me up from school with a rabbit in a box, and she had been drinking with her friend, and they had to finish. They always had like a really narrow window for drinking because they had to finish in time to pick me up from school. So, and they would get a taxi, so there's a lot of admin involved. And they had purchased this rabbit, as a gift for me because I loved animals so much. And, my memory of that time, I was just horrified, because I'd hate it. I'd hate the taxi being there and all of this stuff. But, on this particular day, there's also this giant rabbit who really just wants to get out of the taxi and get out of the box and get away. And I hadn't thought about that for maybe 20 years, And my brother texted me one day and he said, do you remember the rabbit? And suddenly I was there, I was right back there. And I think it is something about a non-human creature that evokes that.
Can we talk about the process of writing? Because all of you think about it a great deal, I think. And Carl, I want to come back because I'm absolutely fascinated that you took stock of yourself and thought, no, I
didn't like what I saw.
Well, you were a tough critic of your earlier novels, right? Which I think are fantastic novels, but I think A Mistake is next level fantastic. And it feels like somebody in complete and magnificent control. And you're right, it doesn't feel like somebody looking at their reflection in a shop window as they're walking along. It just feels like somebody who absolutely fucking knows where they're going. So were you I used this word twice, I think, with you, but I used it with someone else, but were you unsentimental with yourself? Is that weird? Oh, yeah, sorry, that's... a
drinking issue here.
Yeah. How did you have that conversation with yourself?
I think... in part, it's impatience, and like there was the structural thing I was talking about. It's impatience, though. So I'd done a book before this one, which was long, and it was it was so important to me that every sentence be elaborate and multi-claused, and all show-offy stuff. And I was so bored with it. But going back to like what you were talking about right at the outset, and the moot of this, I was. You take stock of yourself and you think, like, what have I done? What am I going to do? I've got limited time. This will take 2 years of my life. I may be dead at any moment. What do I do now? So I took stock of the world, and I thought, like, it was the golden age of TV. I think it's gone rapidly downhill, but about 2 years ago, there was so much good TV, and it was like, how do you get into a brain? How do you, demand someone's attention? And I really returned to sort of first principles, and I thought that there is something in prose fiction and prose non-fiction where once you access the central nervous system, that you've got a kind of access TV, film just can't get, because you're playing, you're like an instrument playing, like a musician playing with someone's imagination, and you actually, if you can get there, and I think you sort of feel it when you've done enough work to get that trust, and the person is actually dancing to your tune, and you're giving them space to maneuver, but you're playing them. And I thought I think that's where the value is in prose fiction, and whenever I was doing this, 2018, that's where, that's the thing that we do. That's what I was thinking.
Can I just say as well, as an editor, a really good short novel is so exciting to receive, because you can all read it pretty much overnight, and then you can all excitedly meet and talk about it and all know that it's wonderful, like pretty much straight away. It's very efficient, is what I'm saying.
Journalism's useful there, I think.
Yeah.
And that was something when I started writing, sort of creative nonfiction. There's a lot of artifacts out there vying for our attention all of the time.
It's a really good point in terms of the moot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when you work in journalism, particularly when you work in television, because we're able to know to the minute when someone switched off us. So we're able to know that people were watching us at 8:11 and they weren't watching it at 8:12. And I say we never have these conversations, but from time to time we do. We say, well, what are we doing at 8:12? Why do people change the channel? I don't like those conversations, but sometimes we're forced to have them. So you think all the time about how you retain people. People think, because people make assumptions about television, that we aim low. I've never aimed low in my career, but I have really worked to understand how I connect. Like, what will keep people? If the story matters enough, you want to keep people.
And I love that, the sort of purity of that impulse as well, because that's why I'm writing. I'm not writing because I like words. I do like words, but I'm not. I'm writing to connect. I'm writing because I'm having a human experience, and I feel somehow that you might know what it is or share it, even though the specifics are all very different.
Whereas Madison and Ashleigh, and actually, no, well, as writers, you don't know. You don't have a sense that somebody put the book down at 11 minutes past 8 in the morning and wandered off and made a cup of tea, or worse than that, changed to the AM show. Fuck them. But you get it later, don't you? Do you get the sense that you held people? How do you know?
It's just I was imagining this horrible universe where, like, maybe you'd get like a text if someone was reading your book and then they stopped reading it.
Isn't that Goodreads? Isn't that what they can do now? They can tell you, 4 stars because it came late in the post or whatever.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if you guys have followed it, but there was this big ruckus on around Goodreads. There's a wonderful US essayist called Lauren Howe who kind of jokily moaned about people giving her 4.5 stars,
4.5 stars
instead of 5, and she called them nerds. And a lot of people were really angry about this, and went on to Goodreads and just immediately gave her 1 or 2 stars to bring her review right down, her average right down.
Brutal.
Really brutal. And now she's on the New York Times bestsellers, so it's pretty great because of that. And also the book's great. But they can tell you. I still carry around this like very embarrassing shame that someone gave me a 2-star review on my last book and wrote this quite sort of elaborate description of all of its flaws. And I would rather not know, but I saw the review and I thought, there's no way I'm not going to read that.
Where did they put it?
Well, this is on Goodreads. Oh. Yeah.
It's the true ones that really sting.
And she was right.
You remember
she was
them
right about
forever.
a lot of it. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's probably best to not think too much about your audience when you're writing. I certainly try to. You want to get into a dream state where there's no such thing as an audience, almost, or maybe you're writing to a really close friend. I think it's crippling otherwise to think about attention spans and Twitter and
Yeah.
In saying that though, when I first got my sisters to, I went down to Dunedin to get my sister to read it, and I watched her read the entire thing. I watched her facial
all of Specimen.
Yeah, and I
you sat in the
noticed
room
when
with
she
her?
laughed, and I peered at her page and was like, oh, there we go.
wonderful. I had a similar experience with one of my brothers in London reading one of my essays that I'd revised, for him, and he sat at the kitchen table, and I was so nervous, and he was laughing. It was just
I did exactly the
greatest
same
gift.
thing.
Yeah.
Real time, because I had published the essay anonymously, in the competition. But when it won, it was going to get published with my name and everybody else's names in it as well. And so I had to tell my family, and I my mum had died, so. My sister was the most important person, and so I stayed on the phone while she read it, and it was the longest. She's a slow reader, Christ, I must have been there for half an hour, just going. I couldn't. Time stopped, and at the end, she said, "That's how it happened," and that was massive. I didn't care really anything else that happened after that.
Madison, I want to come. So if your sister, your brother, and the bits your sister laughed at, are they recurring bits that people laugh at? Because there are bits. I mean, there are moments when I was just almost roaring, and there are other moments where I was just kind of like this, with kind of the embarrassment of going through this experience for you, and so. Do you think they are universal? Do you think people hit more or less the same bits, or is it more particular when it's a family member?
I think there are things that, as a family member, you probably understand at a different level. And I think everyone has a different favourite essay, which is interesting. Some people like the more longer expose ones, and then some people like the funny short ones. So, I don't know.
I want to ask you, because you've all been critically acclaimed and celebrated, what's that like? Seriously, because that you give, you work hard, you study, you write. You write with such an emotional intensity, it matters so much that you do so in bed so you can collapse afterwards. So what is it like when you win a prize? You get shortlisted for the Ockhams, which are this Wednesday night, right? Good luck, Maddie. Wednesday night or Thursday night?
Wednesday night.
Wednesday night, good luck. And what's that? I mean, what is it like for people to say, this matters to me? Ashleigh, can we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond. Yeah, it's beyond imagining, really. Especially when I wrote my book of essays thinking no one would read it, or that maybe no one beyond my family at least. And in a way that that expectation allowed me to write it because I could hold my nerve. Whereas if I'd been imagining that it would have the audience that it did, I would have just hidden from it.
And win a global prize with quite a lot of cash attached.
Yeah,
that was
so
nice, eh?
it's just I still can't quite reconcile myself with it. It was just pretty magical. But then also it reminded me that it is very easy to get sucked into people telling you nice things about yourself. It's irresistible, and it can take you away from the work.
Yeah.
In a maybe not helpful way all the time.
Yeah. Are you wrestling with this, Maddie?
I'm not very good at receiving positive feedback. I don't know how to respond. I'm just like, thanks, and I just feel really awkward and don't know what to say. And then I think most of the time also just goes over my head because I'm always hunting for the negative feedback, which no one gives. And so, I think I've become a little bit used to most of the positive feedback as well, and so I just kind of like, I don't remember it because I focus on the negatives. It's not very good.
No.
It's not uncommon.
Noelle, as broadcasters, you receive the negative in real time, don't you?
Oh God, yeah.
It's extraordinary. I mean, if you're doing RNZ, if you're doing a show at RNZ,
and you've got the texts up
texts
there,
are coming in
people
all the
can
time
see you,
telling you,
and I
well,
stopped
how
reading those.
appalling you are, and they're going to make a complaint to
When is
Sharon
Kim
Crosby
Hill coming back?
this moment.
How long
and
will she be on holiday for?
Yeah.
When are you finished?
And so, whereas as a writer, you're not receiving.
Yeah.
So what? So. Boy, it's a kind of antithetical.
Yep.
It's quite hard to deal with both. I think it's hard to deal with both.
And you know as well as I do, you know, if you're in media, it's likely you probably enjoy people liking you. You know, that's part of why you do it, and you want to have that connection with an audience. But there were different stakes for me with writing, you know, because I'm writing primarily about my mother as well as about myself, and it was a complicated relationship. It is a complicated relationship, you know, it hasn't stopped being complicated because she's died. It's become complicated in a different way. And it is an act of remembering, so there's responsibility there. But I think the prize that I won was amazing because I needed permission. You know, I needed someone to say, like, I'm 42 now and I've been a broadcaster for most of my life and I'm just starting to write. And you need someone to say, you can do this, you know, keep going. And, well, I did. You know, some people don't need that. And, you know, I wish I was like that. But it gave me enough encouragement to go, okay, what's the next step? And what I did after that was, you know, did a writing course with Renee, who's here this weekend, you know, and she's talked about her writing course in her session. And I found her on the internet and sent her a message, you know, and said, you do a memoir course, can I do it? And, you know, she this was the first time I've ever met her, was today, you know, in person. Oh. But we had 10 weeks together, you know, doing this course. And I don't think I would have done that if it hadn't been for the competition. So yeah, I'm really grateful.
Carl, this is a mistake has been acclaimed and acclaimed and acclaimed and acclaimed. Some of the reviews are as rave. I mean, actually, all four of you have had rave reviews, but they're extraordinary. And that, gosh, that must feel good, does it?
Kingsley Amos has this good, appropriate line, I think. It's just nice things are nicer than nasty things. And I mean, I sort of had, at the beginning, I had a prize, and then I had a long fallow period where I was publishing novels, which, you know, I thought 3 novellas set in this near future in Japan about concrete cancer. This is going to be such a hit. I can't believe it. It's amazing. And then I'll do this book about Lebanon because everybody's interested in Lebanon deep down. They don't know it yet, but, you know, and I just have this way of deluding myself. So, but at the time those books were published, I didn't think they were unsuccessful. You know, or, I mean, they were. What is success? You have to define it for yourself. But I still think about, you know, this review or that review for these books 10 years ago, and I think, oh, that was such a good review. Yeah, well done, Carl. But then, you know, you have success, what success really looks like, and it's really busy and frantic, and it's sort of exhausting. And there was like so much going on, and I had a lot going on in my work. So I remember just listening to The Cure's Disintegration again and again and again. So, yeah, I'm probably quite a tightly wired person, and, you know, it was really good, but it was also a relief when it all kind of settled down. And then you kind of add it to the store of confidence and good feelings place.
Are you all writers on the chair and the couch? Are you all tightly wired, do you think?
Shit, yeah.
Yeah.
Wound up. The Cure is my idea of a good time.
Yeah.
You know, that's how I know. It's getting easier as you get older, though, isn't it? And for me, you know, living in Featherston, like that has been a shift in my mind, you know, because I think when you're in a smaller community, it's a different set of priorities, you know, a different type of life.
I think I am. I'm an overthinker, and I have high expectations for myself, and like very fluctuating self-image. I don't know. That goes with, yeah.
But sorry, no. Because I think you're really similar, aren't you?
No, completely. Yeah. Although, as you get older, things start to matter a little bit less. Or things that used to consume
Do they
you.
really?
Well, no, I mean in terms of your self-consciousness and your overthinking. Somehow, it's a little bit easier for me to have perspective on things.
For me, it was my
yeah.
mom's death as well.
Right.
You know, you realize that life is short, and you know you can take a punt and do something, and it might not work, but that's all right. You know, you can just keep going.
I'm enjoying this so much. What time does the session end? Does it end at 4? Does it end before 4? And what's time now? Nearly 4. Has anyone got a question? You completely ignored the mood. It's not that we ignored it, we just forgot what it was. Jesus, how's my dad joke line going? Has anyone got a question? Yes, a question down the back. Belt it out.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's all really, really interesting, and I've enjoyed some of your guys' writing really, really a lot. And I guess my question was, you're all part of people who have profiles, which is really nice. Someone who's people is starting off fresh. Is there a market in New Zealand for short stories still? And we keep hearing about the resurgence of short stories. That's very much a tradition with Catherine Mansfield. But what's the reality of it?
It's a really good question. Well, one of the books that's shortlisted for the big fiction prize at the Occams next week is a book of short stories. And yeah, they are, every so often there will be a really fantastic book of stories that will come out. They're harder than novels, though, to get people's attention, for sure.
So this is different from memoir or personal essays or whatever. This is actually short fiction you're talking about, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the other question, realise that Ashleigh has loved your writing, and so that memoir, which is really more memoir, isn't it? Memoir and essays, is that the way to go now? Does that come to the fore more rather than short fiction?
I mean, there is a lot of blurring going on, I'm seeing, like, between fiction and non-fiction. And there's a lot of really rich and interesting territory there. But no, I think it's honestly, it's trying things out as a writer, seeing what your voice is and where your strengths are.
I think it's such good
That's
advice.
such a vague
Yes,
answer.
go, Carl.
Because the idea of a market, first of all, in New Zealand doesn't exist. And second of all, whatever you think the market is doing now is, by the time your book is written and then published, you're in a whole new world. So you're talking like 2-4 years in the future, and if you can see that far, or you think you can, that's awesome, but you know, most of us can't. So you've got to stay true to, you know, what you think is the best format for you, or what, you know, how you feel it's working for you, what you love to read. Because trying to like play to the market.
Yeah. Although I have to say, when I was looking, like I liked the idea of a competition because it gave me a deadline and, you know, all of those things. And there's lots of short story competitions, aren't there? It seems there's more short story competitions than memoir or non-fiction ones.
I think to take your question, to conclude with, because it's 4 o'clock, so we're wrapping. To take your question, what I would say this stage illustrates is that the best stories are the ones that come from you. And what I've learned about being in television, because television involves an enormous number of meetings about what the audience wants. We're always trying to second-guess the audience. It's a fucking disaster. And by the time that you've second-guessed the audience and made the program, the audience has moved somewhere else anyway. So what we have on this stage is 4 people who have... And Carl, I really thank you for the stock take you've given us of yourself. Because, and I'm not just saying it because you're here, and I'm not just saying it to be polite, because that would be a shitty thing to do. Mistake is a fantastic novel. And the idea that as a result of you looking at yourself and thinking, hold on a sec, what am I doing here and why, makes me like it even more. So what we see on the stage is people who are completely true to themselves. And that's what makes them so good. And if they were true to a notion of what the market wants, and in fact Carl was saying he kind of was previously, then what you don't get is the same particularity, the same individual personality that makes them unique and makes us cherish them. And you don't get the same strengths and you don't get the same authenticity. So write yourself. You'll know what it is. Don't look over your shoulder. Because these 4 have, and it's fantastic. And you know, from time to time people say, well, you do a panel, and I say, oh, who's it with? And they say, oh, it's with X and Y and J and T, and I say, what today? Oh, look, I'm unbelievably busy that weekend. And I wasn't busy this weekend because I wanted to celebrate these 4. And I can't tell you how highly I recommend their work. Madison, your work is, apologies that I've come to you so late, but your work has been a revelation to me. And Noelle, I so wish you well with your long form. And Carl, boy, to see somebody ascend in their art and get better and better and better to the extent that A Mistake is a flawless novel. You know, congratulations. And Ashleigh, you know, because I keep telling you that your writing means an enormous amount to me, so thank you. So the four of you, Carl, Noelle, Maddie, Madison, and Ashleigh, thank you so much for being here this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever we are. And ladies, that was my breakfast sign-off. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for...
And ladies and gentlemen, can we give John Campbell a huge round of applause and thanks for coming to Featherston. Woo!
Thanks everyone. Could I just get you all to exit out this door, not the one you come in from? We've got more people coming in there for the next show.
Test.
Test, test. Good afternoon. Welcome to Kiwi Hall. This is our last event in this venue. It's been a great success today, but we've got one more to go. Today we have Lydia presenting some hidden gems from New Zealand. I'll just go through a quick few things as well. The toilets are down the back if you need them, and the emergency exits are there and here. And if you could please exit through this way towards the end, because they're going to lock down the bookshop 5 o'clock, so we'll still be inside. And I'll now just pass you over to Lydia.
Have you got a watch or something? Have you got a watch or something? Can you do just time? Give me a sense of time when I get to about 10 past 4. Yeah. Well, it's lovely to see you all. Thank you all for coming. Lots of old friends' faces in the audience, which is always nice. I started doing these talks some years ago because I said to Peter and Mary Biggs when they were talking about Booktown and what it did, that one of the things I found kind of slightly problematic about literary festivals is that they always focused on new writers. They focused on the latest publications and the latest people to hit the press. And there's such an ocean of wonderful things out there that people have read and loved in the past that kind of fade from view. So I suggested that since Featherston has a number of old bookshops for secondhand books, it would be good to do a series in which I talked about, or someone, I didn't have to be me, but it ended up being me, talked about writers who had been very popular in their time and were no longer read much, or people. They'd sort of slid into the river of time and no one thought about them much anymore. So this is the third of these talks I've done. My first one was on Mary Scott, and the next one was on Angela Thurkel, and this one today is on Jane Mander. When Jane Mander's best-known novel, The Story of a New Zealand River, I've got that edition, but there are others, was published in 1920, it was received with controversy in New Zealand, despite a more favourable reception elsewhere. The Story of a New Zealand River embarked on another round of controversy in its home country in 2000, when Jane Campion's film The Piano was accused of plagiarism. A charge Campion has aggressively denied, claiming her inspiration came from many sources and declaring, "It's that egalitarian thing about New Zealand. You know, if someone's done well, they must have cheated." In fact, the film rights to Story of a New Zealand River was sold to Bridget Eichen and John Maynard by Amanda's great-nephew, Rangi Cross, in 1985. They wanted Jane Campion to be the director, but while Eichen and Maynard were working on drafts, Jane Campion got involved in funding and developing her own film, originally called The Piano Player, and as it took off, the New Zealand production was dropped. I tell this tale, presumably involving some ill feeling, as Campion and Eichen were long-term friends, because for many people, the success of The Piano and its ensuing row will have been the first time they heard of Mander's novel. But for those who knew the novel, there are too many plot similarities between The Story of a New Zealand River, which Campion acknowledges she has read, and The Piano, for Campion's claims that her film has nothing to do with the novel to ring true. A young woman with a child born out of wedlock marries a man who runs a sawmill on a river in the far north and reluctantly falls in love with her husband's best friend. Of course, there are changes and nuances, and The Piano is not, and does not claim to be, the film of the book. It is not plagiarism. But the film and the book are twinned creations. In her denials, Campion was perhaps trying to avoid the question of copyright. But the benefit of this mirroring is, as Campion herself has said, that Mander's novel came back into view as a minor classic of New Zealand literature, a novel that is ahead of its time in many ways. It is a book with some flaws, but nevertheless a gem of our early literary history, because, as Joan Stevens remarked in 1961, it stands out as an example of a novel which is really about something, though there might be some discussion about what that is. The Story of a New Zealand River is Jane Mander's first published novel. She drafted it in 1914 while living in the United States. It was, can everyone hear me with that going on next door? Is that all right? I could be a bit louder. Okay, bring this close. Just wave if you're not hearing me, because I'm conscious it's a long way down to the back of the hall. It was accepted for publication in 1918, apparently the only novel accepted that year by John Lane, and appeared in 1920. I can really hear that that's better. Is that better? Yeah, good. Mander wrote 5 subsequent novels which were published and mentions at least 2 more, one of which she destroyed after it was rejected. Her last novel was published in 1928, which is an astonishing period of activity, 6 novels in 8 years. She was a contemporary of Catherine Mansfield and Frances Hodgkins, and would have agreed with Hodgkins when she remarked that New Zealanders were lovely people, so hospitable and charming, but for God's sake, don't talk to them about art. Like them, Jane Mander spent her creative years as an expatriate. It is not really the case that Jane Mander and The Story of a New Zealand River are hidden gems. There have been 2 books written about Mander, one for Twain in their World Author series by Dorothea Turner, and a biography by Ray McGregor. Mander always appears in literary histories, and while hers might not be a name that trips off the tongue like Catherine Mansfield's, it's not so dusty that no one knows it. It's just that if people have read any of Mander's novels, it tends to be Story of a New Zealand River, or as a second string, Ellen Adair, her novel about men on the gumfields. The other novels are only to be found in specialist libraries like the Turnbull. And it's nice to see some Turnbull people here. What interests me is the narrative arc of all 6 of her novels. Written in such a short space of time, they inevitably share common threads, particularly female sexuality, life in the Northland bush, and Puritanism. The trajectory of her novels, which move from New Zealand settings to New York and then London, is towards a bleaker view of life. And it's not really surprising that after her London novel, Pins and Pinnacles, she returned to New Zealand, though it was far from an easy return, as I shall discuss later. When River was published, it was reviewed by Catherine Mansfield for the Athenaeum. She described it as being covered with the false wrappings of unnecessary technical devices. She meant too much unwieldy description, and said the novel leans too hard on England. She said it should have been half as long and twice as honest. She had a good critical eye, Catherine Mansfield. But she also said that once you looked past the false wrappings, there was the root of something very fresh and sturdy. Mansfield perceptibly conjectured that the reason Manda's novel was so timid with its genuflections to English conventions was because round the corner there was a little band of jeering, sneering, superior persons ready to leap up and laugh if the cut of the newcomer's jacket is not of the strangeness they consider admissible. When it appeared in New Zealand, the Dominion reviewer described it as sex problem fiction. And in Whangarei, Manda's hometown, it went on the library's discretionary list in the librarian's room, along with Tess of the D'Urbervilles and the Water Gypsies. According to Dorothea Turner, the view that The Story of a New Zealand River was unsuitable reading for what she called the unsophistic young lasted at least a decade. So what is so shocking about it? First, Asia, the young daughter of the main female character, Alice Rowland, is born out of wedlock to an undisclosed father. Alice, a highly repressed and irritatingly conventional woman, and if you listened to Kim Hill talking to me last week, you will know that Kim Hill hates her. She is sent by her English family to Australia to have the baby, and while there she marries Tom Rowland, who is a bushman and a sawmiller. Alice, her little girl, and 2 smaller children from her marriage eventually travel to the far north to join him in Pukekaroro on a tributary of the Otamatea River, which is off the Kaipara Harbour. She is appalled by the post-binge dirtiness of the man sent to meet them, an alcoholic English doctor called David Bruce, and treats him rudely. She is equally dismayed by the isolation of the settlement and the crudeness of the house Rowland and Bruce have built for the family. Lined but unpapered, nothing but a sack on the bare floor. Asia, however, I find that name interesting, and I don't know quite how to explain why Asia has such an unconventional name, but it marks her out as a personality both in the novel and kind of in English terms. It's an unusual and unconventional name to give your daughter at this time. Asia, who is an indomitably cheerful, joyful even, 8-year-old, who becomes the new woman heroine of the novel, is delighted with everything. Alice has brought her piano and makes friends with Mrs. Brayton, an Englishwoman living nearby who counsels her against condemning the uncouth working men in her life, urging her to look beyond their appearance. Alice is unable to do this in the case of her husband, and though she falls in love with David Bruce, recognising him as a gentleman, second shocking revelation, love outside marriage, she is tormented by her sense of propriety and can't let herself really love him, even though her own marriage goes from worse to worse, bad to worse, and she is aware that Tom has a long-standing sexual liaison with another woman. Asia, the free spirit raised in the bush, resolves towards the end of the novel that mother has taught me one great lesson. I'm done with misery. I shall have nothing more to do with it as long as I live. Asia leaves Pukekaroro to earn her living, falls in love with a separated Australian architect, and goes to live with him unmarried in Sydney. Alice is a familiar figure in New Zealand literature, the oppressively Puritan mother and wife, unable to relinquish herself to sexuality or emotions, imprisoned by gentility. But Asia is the opposing generation, a figure of self-determination and liberation repeated in all Manda's novels, though never as charmingly as in The Story of a New Zealand River. Manda wrote to a friend later in life that there are Asias, and I was interested in bringing a parent to the difficult and rare attitude of hands off. The Story of a New Zealand River is highly autobiographical, except that Jane Manda was never able to liberate herself as completely as Asia does from the social and familial expectations of women. Manda said that River was inspired by Olive Schreiner's revolutionary feminist novel, The Story of an African Farm, published in 1883. Pregnancy, premarital sex, and childbirth out of wedlock are all themes in Schreiner's novel, and the heroine, Lyndall, does not believe in God, but in self-determination, which, considering that Schreiner grew up in an extremely conservative Boer family in the Karoo, which is the Dutch-speaking part of South Africa, is a very radical and revolutionary thing to do. Schreiner published under a male pseudonym, but by Manda's time, and possibly because she published first in New York, she put her own name on the cover. A wonderful factoid about Oliver Schreiner, which I can't resist telling you, and which I think has to sit in the history of her rebellion against her environment, is that her full name was Olive Amelia Albertina Schreiner, and she was named after three brothers, Oliver, Emile, and Albert, who died before she was born. So the whole of her life she carried her three brothers on her shoulders. Jane Manda's own life is reflected in The Story of a New Zealand River in a variety of ways. She was the eldest of the 5 children of Francis and Janet Manda, born at Ramarama near Drury on April the 9th, 1877. By 1885, the family were living at Pukekaroro, location for the novel Story of a New Zealand River, north of Dargaville on the Kaipara Harbour. Francis Manda had had a hard life and supported himself from the age of 10. He worked at bush felling and milling. Manda wrote later that her father was a rover, and they sometimes moved as much as 3 times in a year. She estimated the family moved 29 times while she was growing up, living in shacks or small shops when there were no houses until we built one ourselves. Later in life, she wrote to Pat Lawler, the Wellington journalist, that of course she concentrated 2 characters and 2 points of view in David and Alice, David Bruce and Alice Rowland, but was not advocating anything, simply presenting people as she finds them. All sorts of people made their old life in the north, and so I put them in. A lot of readers claimed to know the originals of her characters, but she insisted that no characters whatever were taken from the district, except the fine old lady, Mrs. Brayton, who could not possibly have objected. Her son has always been delighted with the picture I made of her. Also, I was only 9 when we left that place, and we never had any mill or village there. It is most amusing how people will try all wrongly to fit people they know into a book. The fine old lady is Mrs. Brayton, exemplar of cultivated Englishness in the novel. You might remember, if you've read it, that when Alice first goes to see her, she opens the gate, and in front of her is what is in effect an English garden, an English house with English sophistication, a piano, books, music is played, oriental rugs on the floor. It's a kind of a little element of England, and hard to imagine really, in the far north bush, and probably one of the things that Catherine Mansfield meant when she said that Jane Manda leant too hard on England. In 1952, Mrs. B.M. Coates of Kaiwaka wrote to the listener that Mrs. Brayton in the novel was based on Mrs. Clayton, who brought one of the first pianos to New Zealand. It was lent to Mrs. Coates, who played it for many years until it was almost beyond tuning, at which point she offered it to the local museum who didn't want it. Finally, what with rats and damp, it became useless, so that pieces of it were used to repair other pianos. Much to my regret, the historic piano became a thing of the past, all except the strings on their wooden frame, which I still possess. All the significant people in Manda's novels own and play pianos. When Valerie Carr in The Strange Attraction, moves into an ugly pub in Dargaville, she finds a piano in the sitting room and starts playing old Irish airs. The men in the pub below begin to sing, and soon the house is filled with a strong masculine chorus. In The Passionate Puritan, Mana, a chiefly Māori woman living in the bush, plays and sings with her piano. The only exception who doesn't have a piano is Ellen Adair, possibly because it is the only novel focused on a man. The character of Tom Rowland, like Jack Ridgway in The Passionate Puritan, Thomas McAlany in The Strange Attraction, or Jack Asbury in Ellen Adair, is based on Manda's father, Francis, a self-educated man, a diamond in the rough, tough, practical, resourceful. These men are contrasted with gentlemen like David Bruce or Arthur Devereux in The Passionate Puritan, whose Englishness, exhibited in superior taste, class and education, is offset by other failings like alcoholism and philandering, and actually drug taking in one of them, probably opium. Manda's relationship with her father became very difficult in his later years, but he was a very successful businessman and later long-serving politician for Massey's Reform Party. In 1902, Francis Manda bought the Northern Advocate, which was the most popular daily newspaper in the North, where Jane worked for 4 years as a writer and sub-editor. She said, "At times I ran the department single-handed from leaders to proofs, and the proudest boast of my life is that I once brought out the paper 4 days running without a mistake and caught the 4 o'clock train." After a time spent teaching when she was young, Manda earned her living from journalism, editing and reading for publishers for most of her life, occupations reflected in her female characters. Valerie Carr in The Strange Attraction is a journalist in Dargaville and can also run the paper single-handed if needed. Sydney Carey in The Passionate Puritan leaves Auckland to experience life in the rough as a teacher in a small bush-felling community. Chris Mayne in The Besieging City is an activist, journalist and novelist. And Mirabelle Heath in her last novel, Pins and Pinnacles, a book designer and illustrator. In 1912, Manda left New Zealand for New York to study journalism at Columbia, taking with her the draft of a novel which was rejected by 4 different publishers, which she then destroyed. At Columbia, she found herself made much of as a New Zealander, seen as the representative of a progressive society that had universal suffrage. She became friends with the daughters of affluent families, and the contrast between a hand-to-mouth existence and the materialism and wealth of New York is a running commentary in her New York novel. She withdrew from her course at Columbia after 2 years, joined the suffragette campaign in New York, spoke at rallies, and wrote for the cause as well as working for the Red Cross. During this time, she was drafting The Story of a New Zealand River, which was published in 1920. She wrote 2 more novels in New York and in 1923 moved to London. It is at this point, after the success of The Story of a New Zealand River, and with the exception of Ellen Adair, which is widely thought to be as successful as River and the only other of her books to be reprinted, that her novels become much more overtly autobiographical and focused on what Arthur Devereux in The Passionate Puritan calls the problem of men and women. Both The Passionate Puritan and The Strange Attraction were written at the suggestion of a friend in New York with an eye to making money from the movies. The Turnbull copy of The Strange Attraction is inscribed by Manda as an unsuccessful attempt to write a novel that would screen. Both are novels set in the bush, but unlike River, are more obviously romances, though like all Manda's romance narratives, their real subject is sexual politics, and what they are really against is marriage. Sydney Carey is the passionate Puritan of the title of Manda's 1922 novel. Set in 1912, she is a recently qualified teacher who has lived far too much in books and decides to take a job as a sole teacher in Puhipuhi, a sawmilling settlement north of Whakapara. Sydney is escorted up a steep and scary incline on the timber trucks to Puhipuhi by Jack Ridgefield, son of the mill owner, taciturn, hazel-eyed, practical and strong, classical romance material. He arranges everything for her, and she is well on the way to developing special feelings for him when he goes off to Auckland and comes back with a wife. Puhipuhi is also not what she expects. It does not conform to her expectations of raw human material. Everyone is making and saving money, and it is almost a perfect specimen of bourgeois respectability. The only blot on the town is Mrs. Bill, neglectful mother to 11 children, only a few of whom look like Bill. Sydney is the object of everyone's attention, and in order to escape continual scrutiny, she goes into the bush to visit her 3 Māori pupils, where she finds, in a delightful, and for its time I think, very interesting, ironic reversal of the Mrs. Brayton character in Story of a New Zealand River, reversing the ingrained stereotypes of New Zealand fiction at this period, she finds a bush cottage surrounded with flowers, fields with horses and cows, grapevines, beehives, a large vegetable garden, and inside she is astonished to see a piano, books and pictures. Their owner, Mana, is a woman of patrician ancestry and the sensuous charm of the South Seas. Though Manda's prose retains what you can only think of now as racist generalisations, Mana is always favourably contrasted with the materialist and social climbing Pākehā of the village. Not long after this, Sydney meets the hero of the novel, Arthur Devereux, whose English riding suit, fine boots and silver-headed crop give him away as the love interest. Always in Manda's New Zealand novels, there is a tension between English gentility and rough, practical but honest colonial men. Women don't come off so well. In the Story of a New Zealand River, there is a wonderful scene when Tom Rowland expresses astonishment that Alison Bruce and David Bruce have not been consummating their love for each other, pointing out that for years he has been very careful to be away a lot and always announce in advance his time of return. Sydney Carey is immediately taken with Arthur's rich speaking voice, good looks and fine athletic build, and through the various climaxes of the plot, fire, death, childbirth, they fall in love with each other. What distinguishes Manda from these predictable patterns, and probably why this novel, and A Strange Attraction, did not make it to the screen, is that Arthur is not only already unhappily married, but also enjoying a covert sexual relationship with Mana. He doesn't tell Sydney any of this when he proposes, and when she confronts him about his marriage, he says he is waiting for the divorce to come through. He has some fast Auckland friends and takes Sydney on a weekend trip with 6 other couples. The men will come to breakfast in their pyjamas, and Sydney feels very uncomfortable. Arthur has some beautiful blue silk pyjamas. Sometime later, Sydney sees these pyjamas drying on Mana's washing line, confirming her suspicions that Arthur has been seeing Mana for some time and not only for musical evenings. She convinces herself that Arthur is the father of Mana's new baby. A white and a Māori baby are mixed up in a little plot twist. And her relationship with Arthur is unfavourably compared with the strength and ideals of the Jack Ridgefield marriage. Things get resolved, but not in the usual manner of romance. Manda is really an anti-romance writer, though she uses the romance narrative. Arthur acknowledges his relationship with Mana. The baby proves not to be his. He confides to Sydney that Jack Ridgefield works so hard, stays at home and at the mill because he knows he would give in to temptation elsewhere, and he delivers a lecture about infidelity. It is incidental. It is the least of marital tragedies, the least of reasons for divorce. Sydney blames herself for her ridiculous mistakes and sees, unlike Alice Rowland, that she wanted Arthur anyway and would have had him whatever he had done. It is a romance ending in that the two people who are clearly destined to be together end up together, but not a sanitised one. The passionate Puritan uncovers, or starts to uncover, the hard edges of gendered sexuality and the difficulties posed for women who have to negotiate their sexuality in such prescribed social terms. Manda raises not only the question of male freedoms, but also the roles of women in policing sexual behaviour, something her heroines increasingly reject. Valerie Carr, the journalist protagonist of A Strange Attraction, is repelled by the social life of the important people in Dargaville. What she detested most about these people was that they were poor copies of other imitations, all straining their imaginations in the process of worshipping the correct thing. Valerie has come to Dargaville with childhood friend Bob Lorimer to run the local paper. He has hopes of her, but she roundly rejects him, accusing him of being like the relatives in Auckland. Auckland doesn't come off well. You promised if I came up here that you would treat me as if I were a man and an independent stranger. I feel your criticism every day. You were mad when I ordered ale for lunch. You were mad when I played to a party of sailors. You are mad because I'm talked about. Instead, she falls for a sybaritic Australian, Dane Barrington, very romance names, a writer with ambiguous marital status who lives in a house outside town filled with Oriental treasures and Chinese servants. Dane has a reputation that reaches as far as Auckland and a beautiful singing voice, but he can also do practical things like mend the printing press when it breaks down. Valerie's father, a tall, handsome lawyer with an arrogant head and dissipated face, warns her often to no avail. But when Dane proposes marriage, Valerie bursts out with a speech that feels as if it comes from Jane Manda's mouth. Nobody can ever believe I have a principle, an idea I want to live by. I'm not the first woman in the world who didn't want to marry, and yet everyone treats me as if I were. I'm not the first woman to say I want a career and a lover instead of a husband and children. Will you understand me? I am not domestic. I do not want to darn your socks. I do not want to put your slippers by the fire. I do not want to put buttons on your shirts. I do not want children. In 1932, Amanda wrote to the journalist and writer Monty Holcroft about the birth of his first child. She said, quote, "Since you both feel as you do about it, congratulations on the boy." Not a response guaranteed to gladden the hearts of new parents. Valerie Carr consents to marry Dane Barrington as long as the marriage is kept secret, so to the outside world they appear to be living in sin. Dane refers to the marriage as a passport, a perfectly good passport, the thing we should try to live by. You don't have to look after me when I am nervous or seedy. Seedy is code for his drug taking, unspecified, but probably opium given the Oriental cast of his household. Valerie suspects this, but it is undeclared between them, including the reason for it. Dane turns out to have an incurable illness. What Valerie is fighting against is being like her mother, her sisters, her father, her aunts. A nice, sweet thing. I look at women like that and they make me sick. I mean to fight about ideas. The Strange Attraction is the only one of Manda's novels to refer to actual political trends in her time. Campaigning for Massey's Reform Party, taking sides in the Spanish Civil War. Many of her New Zealand critics, including Alan Mulgan, dismissed her novels as sex-obsessed. Manda's rebuttal was that she was only trying to be honest. She could also have pointed out that sex, too, is a fight about ideas. Manda's life was full of fights about ideas. In New York, she campaigned for suffragism, worked for the Red Cross, and was interested in prison reform. When she came back to New Zealand, she wrote articles critical of New Zealand writers, so trivial, so sentimental, so pathetic, and attacked New Zealand's weak literary tradition. She particularly reviled, rather to my regret since I like them, the novels of Mrs. Scott, which she dismissed as absolute tripe. Ideas about the status and role of women dominate her fiction to the point where the romance plots become hard to believe, which is what Kim Hill objected to. She couldn't believe that a man as nice as David Bruce would hang around waiting for someone like Alice Rowland. In 1916, she published an article in the New Republic called Sheltered Daughters. The sheltered daughter is to be found in all kinds of homes where economic pressure has not found its way. She is one of the crimes for which poverty is not responsible. She may be preserved for various ends, of which the three most clearly defined are the marriage market, obviously originated with the woman as property idea, safety in the hands of the Lord, and the comfort and use of her parents. It is perhaps coincidence, but certainly interesting, that of the 5 Manda children, only 1 brother and 1 sister married. It is not coincidence, but very sad, that Jane ended her life looking after her cantankerous and demanding father, exhibiting the comfort and use of her parent. The Strange Attraction finishes with Valerie leaving to help the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. She does so partly from her conviction that she must do something about the state of the world, and partly because she has witnessed Dane in narcotic unconsciousness and concludes, I don't want to stay until I hate him. Dane, who is dying of an undisclosed illness, urges her to go. The moral honours are pretty evenly divided, but Dane is probably the more empathetic character. Alan Adair is Manda's last novel set in New Zealand. As a young man, Alan can't get interested in any of the career paths his father wants for him, Oxford man, businessman, farmer, and finally resorts to leaving home for the unrespectable north, land of lost men, peopled with nomads and wasters, the roadless north, with rivers, harbours and bush, but no land. Couldn't be a farmer there. Alan becomes the storekeeper on a gum field and marries a girl from Auckland who cares more about having a silver tea service than a productive cow. It is a fatally misaligned marriage. Marion exemplifies a lot of gender stereotypes and Alan reacts with predictable aversion. And to feminists, this list of faults is very familiar territory. She is too curious, she cares about the wrong things, she is too emotional, she talks too much, she doesn't like the isolation of the bush. While Alan doesn't get off without critique, here's where the novel's sympathies lie. Alan prefers to spend his time with a taciturn and secretive Englishman living on the gum field, and when this man is cleared of a crime, he goes back to England, leaving Alan bereft of an emotional centre. These homosocial bonds are present throughout Manda's New Zealand novels, especially in the pairings of rough colonials and cultivated Englishmen. Her last 2 novels set outside New Zealand gesture towards same-sex attraction. It's as if homosociality is a natural part of the masculine bush culture, and of course there's lots of it in New Zealand literature. You have to think of Frank Sargison, I mean really anyone, Cole Flatt, Bill Pearson, there's lots and lots of homosociality in New Zealand literature. But it's as if in her novels, homosociality is naturally present in the bush, but homosexuality can only flourish in the city. In The Besieging City, Manda's novel about New York, which features an Australian heroine, Chris Mayne, she is told by one of her admirers, Redmond Phelps, that they live in an intestinal era. Beastly curiosity and gossip, I loathe it. But I think an increasing number of people have ceased to be well-defined males or females. Mentally, at least, we are breeding a bisexual creature, a composite, a third sex. And I think there's an argument to be made that this notion of a third sex is what Manda was trying to move towards an expression of in her fiction. By third sex, she does not mean what we might imagine today, an LGBTQI person, but she says, people who can sit in the dark in a movie theatre without becoming victims of the instinct for reproducing themselves. What is coyly referred to as the life force in Manda's novels is responsible for hardened gender assumptions and socially inbuilt incompatibilities. The only escape is to flout romance and social convention, though none of the novels goes so far as to leave the heroine on her own. And it's, I think, a kind of interesting parallel track between her pursuit of the conventional romance ending in which heroine's not left on her own at the end of the romance novel, and her own life, in which she seems to have chosen to be a single woman with independence running her own life, even though that ended up quite sadly. Marriage is increasingly not the solution for any of Manda's heroines. The besieging city flirts with same-sex attraction. One of Chris Main's friends, Myra, kills herself after her devotion to Chris is declared and brutally rejected, despite a scene in which there are more than hints of mutual attraction. After Asia and Story of a New Zealand River, there are no examples of contented partnerships in her narratives. There is love, but only a very tempered happiness. New York itself in the novel is full of deaths, some from neglect and poverty, others from cruelty, including some men who use their car to run down a dog in the street. The hard contrasts between wealth and poverty encountered every day in the city, the effects of wartime, life in post-war New York, are disenchanting. Chris's remark that everyone returns to New York does not ring true, as she rejects a marriage proposal and heads for London. These experiences and travels mirror Manda's own trajectory. She went to London in 1923 after 11 years in the States and published there her last 4 novels. The last, Pins and Pinnacles, was published in 1928. She regarded it as the most saleable book I have written. It focuses on Mirabel Heath, the children's book illustrator, and her circle of intellectual London friends, which includes the reclusive mystery man next door with whom she shares a garden. He, of course, is the love interest. Manda said, "It is, I suppose, quite healthy in tone, but one of the interesting things about it is that Mirabel has been married before, and it's a marriage that is not unlike the marriages in sensation novels of the 1890s, where young, inexperienced girls marry army men, it's always army men, experienced army men, with venereal disease, which results in deformed babies and early deaths." There's a famous one by Sarah Grand called The Best Book, which you might want to look up if you're interested in that kind of thing. The new women novelists were arguing against marriage at all costs, and particularly for inexperienced young girls. In some respects, this is also Manda's argument, that being unmarried is a choice and not a disgrace, and that most young women are criminally ignorant of the facts of life, although she in fact wasn't. Mirabel Heath, reflecting on her first marriage at the age of 21 to a 40-year-old man, a marriage engineered by her American mother, realises that what she had needed to save her from that smash was a little medical information. Her short physical intimacy with Norman Heath had been an experience so sickening that she never afterwards looked back into it. Her American uncle offers her a revolver and tells her to use it if he ever comes near her again. And when the child is born, it is so badly born that its grandmothers turn sick at the sight of it, and Mirabel was never allowed to see it. Fortunately, because this is a romance, both the baby and Norman Heath die in fairly short order, and Mirabel, who goes nursing in France, came by degrees to be healed of the loathing of the sex polluted for her by her husband. The rest of Pins and Pinnacles is a straightforward enough romance plot. Mirabel comes to realise she wants someone to love, and Paul Daly emerges from his isolation and the widespread view that he doesn't like women, perhaps brought on by his Batman who gives him a rub-down every evening, and responds to her independence and kind. They are, the text says, well-mated lovers. Other male characters are ambiguous. Evan, who has the handsomest staff in London with no avoirdupois, even the cook is slender, and Anthony Field, a misogynist artist whose lover is the girl next door. It's interesting to compare this with Catherine Mansfield's London, because of course they're writing at roughly similar times. A city in which her heroines are also betrayed, attracted by unsuitable and even evil men, experience nascent same-sex attraction, and are anguished by conventional expectations. Mansfield left a considerable record of how she lived that life of ambiguous sexuality and ill-fitting liaisons. But there's really very little information about how Amanda lived her London years, emotionally or sexually, though you could make some suppositions, I think, from her novels. The other interesting thing about Pins and Pinnacles is that Paul Daly has a friend who has been driven mad by his demanding, hysterical and diseased, as Daly puts it, mother and sister. There's a lot of psychology in these novels. Although John, the friend, commits a murder and is increasingly insane, the blame for his behaviour is squarely placed on his intolerably possessive mother and sister. Family gender wars are always the root of trouble in Manda. When Manda came back to New Zealand in 1932, she was 55. Her mother had died and she was plunged into caring for her demanding, cantankerous and miserly father. She wrote to Monty Holcroft, "I am doing all the housework and gardening, and my old father wants someone to play cards with him every evening, a most fearful bore and a waste of time. I simply wish to go up to my room and write. I'm not getting a penny from my father. What a life I live with a miser and a pathological case of rage every day against such a fate. And yet I suppose there are worse ones. I'm getting very tired." She finds the youth of Auckland incredibly crude and smug and sure of themselves. "I simply long to go to the far north and be alone." She earned extra money by writing articles and giving talks, but believed that no one else will ever be able to do that gum country of the north, which is in my blood and bones. She didn't succeed in publishing another novel, but it is poignant to think of her craving the landscapes of her childhood, landscapes which she powerfully and emotionally evokes in her early novels. The sweep of the river in Story of a New Zealand River as it progresses further and further into the bush. The magnificent stands of Kauri, whose felling and massive grey stumps provoke excitement, but also sadness. The bushy gullies, enchanting views that each heroine discovers on her walks out of the small, oppressive, closed-mind settlements. The pleasures of being alone, particularly felt by Alan Adair on his gum field, as he watches the wall of a storm come towards him and flocks of birds rise in the wind. The gum field is a sanctuary for the world's lost men. It offers privacy and silence, things that Jane Manda also craved. In New York, there is a single tree that Chris Mayne stops to glory at, and in London there are private gardens. But the reduction in those two city novels of natural beauty from the breathless description of tripping the timber dams in The Passionate Puritan, or Alan Adair looking out into the sun rising over the gum fields, to these late novels is charged with feeling. Although Manda's primary focus was always on the working psychology of her characters, their difficult and imposing ambitions and emotions, their conflicting sexualities, their entrapment in social conventions, her own heart was always most clearly expressed when she writes about living in the bush. When Joan Stevens said she wrote about something, the sights and sounds and feel of that colonial landscape in all its moods is what she draws on and brings back to her 21st century readers like us. Thank you for listening. I'm very happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Can't promise I'll always be able to answer them, but if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free. But you're probably dying to get away for a glass of wine or onto your next event, so don't feel you have to. Yes.
I'd just like to say that there are some things that for Jane Campbell will be
Yeah.
suggestion of papers. What happened, this is the with John and Bridget Icon, they owned the rights to Jane Mander's story.
Yeah.
They went to my sister and they said, would you please write the screenplay? And she read the book, and like Kim Hill, she said, no, I hated it. So a month went by. Then they came back and said, look, please, can you write a longer synopsis? And she said, okay, but I'm going to do it my way. My influences are Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and the Bronte sisters, which she was obsessed, especially the Heathcliff aspect. Then she handed that back to them. They then said, we hate it, it's nothing like the river. And so she said, well, hold on, I've spent months on this, and I have done an enormous amount of research. I want to go up to where the Howarth, where the Brontes hang out, and I want to write the piano. They said, well, we're going to get someone else to write the river. So they got someone else to write that screenplay, and they didn't manage to get any capital. Now, when you're trying to raise money for a big project like the piano, it is scrutinised. So it doesn't just go to a barrister, it goes to Queen's Counsel. And their firm opinion is that it is her work. Now, there are, of course, similarities. New Zealand, our piano, our girl. But for all those things that a mirror will only reflect what you put in it. So for all, I can be looking for all those similarities, or I can be looking for a great deal of differences. For example, the piano playing. Alice is playing the Appassionata and Pathétique of Beethoven. These are virtuoso pieces.
Yes.
She plays them in the tea party. It would have taken 45 minutes, and that's from someone who's a professional piano player. She doesn't come from wealth. Where would she have got these skills? You know, there are a lot of different sources, whereas Michael Nyman is supporting the emotional muteness and mental states of the Holly Hunter character.
I thought it was very, very clever to make the central character mute, because it does all the things that the river does in a more prolix way, much more powerfully. And I mean, thank you for what you've said, and I accept all of that. I was quoting something that has been written about it. I think it's just interesting that this is a sort of an story in a way about women in the bush, which Manda and Jane Campion come to, perhaps starting from a quite similar place, but make such very different, and I think in your sister's case, much more powerful expressions of. So I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but it's useful to have all that extra detail, because that's not, I haven't seen that reported.
And also, Jane Manda herself used a lot of the main character, Shriners.
Yeah, she did.
She virtually took out that piece. Gregory Rose, who is nursing
Yes.
the lead character, and both of them, both Alice and this woman, have stillborn children.
Yeah.
And the big deal there is that these men are in a very, very intimate way with these women, with their vaginas. So this is the big thing with Alice, that she
Yes.
mentions her beats her daughter, etc., because she cannot accept that she might have liked it, for example.
Yes.
But both novels have that fiction in them.
Yes, they do. Yes, she recommended Story of an African Farm to people all the time and acknowledged her debt to it. And you know, and the title makes that very clear as well. But I didn't want to spend all my time on a story of a New Zealand river, because Actually, I think what is quite interesting is what she does after the story of the New Zealand River, which is much less well known because people can't read it. But thank you. Anyone else? Well, I certainly won't be, since I'm not a publisher. I think it's not terribly likely they'll be republished. If they were, they would be published in some kind of series that, you know, Australia, there's a lot of them in Australia, for example, that brings novels which have languished in libraries back into the light. And there, you know, there might be some interest in doing that, but really the publishing decisions that have been made have identified her two best novels, which are A Story of the New Zealand River and Alan Adair. So I don't think it's terribly likely, but it's quite interesting to see how all the concerns that are surfacing, the political interests as well as the sexual politics that are surfacing in Story of the New Zealand River and in Alan Adair from the other point of view, are worked through those later novels. More crudely in some respects. Yes.
So yeah, it's marvellous to hear you unpack Jane Mander and
I didn't even notice them. Yes.
Again, thank you very much for enlightening us about somebody who has slipped into history. But it's almost a bit of a tease, isn't it? Because now if we do want to read them, we can.
Well, you'll have to go to Toombul where you can read them. But you do have to sit in Toombul to read them, so perhaps a slightly different experience, but it's also a very nice one. Yeah. No, really, I don't. I think she did influence some other New Zealand women writers, like G.B. Lancaster and Jean Devaney, who read her. I think she was part of a more general, well, I think she was part of, but also perhaps slightly accelerated, the critique of sexual and social convention that surrounded women for a long time. I mean, Frank Sargison, who had critical things to say about Mander, nevertheless is dealing with the same subject matter in almost everything he writes. And that's been loosely called Puritanism in New Zealand literature, the sort of critique of Puritanism, which is done by a lot of people mid-century. This is also what she's doing, but she is much more frank about the sexual politics of Puritanism than many other people in her time were. Well, thank you for coming and listening to me, and thank you for your questions, and we'll leave it at that. Oh, good. Oh, good. Oh, good. Oh, I'm pleased.
I read the Story of the New Zealand River when I was about 13. I found it in school.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Marina.
And I loved the way you did it. It was quite rose and blue. Well, I didn't recognise that.
Well, I think actually Story of the New Zealand River is not so much.
It's different.
The later ones.
Yes. I really found that so interesting. I think I tried to read Alan Adair. I must have been, because that's the 60s.